Lies and a false alibi. In their closing argument, the prosecution claim that Stephen McCullagh carefully planned Natalie McNally's murder.
He denies the killing but did not give evidence in court, and the prosecution asked the jury to consider why. I'm Kelly Bonner.
And I'm Chris Buckler, and with some distressing details and strong language, this is BBC News NI's coverage of the Natalie McNally murder trial. So, on day 16 of the trial, the prosecution made their final arguments, bringing the days of evidence together in an attempt to present a coherent case against the defendant, Stephen McCullagh. He denies killing Natalie McNally, his pregnant girlfriend, but today the prosecution barrister Charles McCrainer accused him of lies and went through what he argued are the inconsistencies in his story, and he made a real point of asking why Stephen McCullagh refused to give evidence in front of the jury. And that was a big issue today, Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen McCullagh told the jury that he wouldn't be given evidence on Monday, but Charles McCrainer said today, look, that is his right, but that means that they can't test the evidence on him, and the trial is meant to test evidence. He asked the jury, what is his true reason not to give evidence? One reason could be that there is no answer he could ever give that could stand up to scrutiny. But he said, if you were innocent and you thought you could explain, would you not give evidence? If there's an innocent explanation, you'd have heard it. And he said Stephen McCullagh's failure of explaining is something that can be used against him.
Now, as part of the closing argument from the prosecution, they talked about the video clips from the live stream that Stephen McCullagh initially used as an alibi. We're going to show you again a bit of what the jury saw. And the prosecution were pushing this idea that Stephen McCullagh was making constant reference to him being live, that it was a Sunday, that it was a week before Christmas. And of course, that wasn't the case. Here's just a small section of that video.
Oh, hello to all on this glorious Sunday evening. So I just thought, why not? I'm going to do a live stream because this day next week is Christmas. So what more could you want for Christmas other than an evening with your old pal Stephen?
Now, we saw much more than that small section of the live stream, or the so-called live stream. And the prosecution asked the jury to focus on specific things in that live stream, which initially Stephen McCullagh said he was doing live, but actually turned out to be pre-recorded days before. And some of what they wanted them to focus on was the point where Stephen McCullagh got angry and where he mentioned Natalie.
Yeah, now before we talk about that, throughout the stream was being played, Stephen McCullagh sat stroking his beard, as we've seen him do before. This time he was smiling throughout it. He was at times laughing to himself in the dock. Now, we heard him time and time again tell the camera that he wasn't leaving the house at all. He was laughing at times. I would say he sounded quite manic at times when he was laughing. He was talking about, feeling drunk. He made reference to him being an angry drunk, but an absolute sweetheart in real life. We also saw a part in the live stream where he swore. Now, just a warning, I'm actually going to quote him directly here. He says, "Absa-fucking-Natalie." And then he looked directly at the camera and he said, "Absa-fucking-Natalie." And Charles McCrainer made reference to that and said this was not in the world of affection, because he was using a swear word against Natalie. And Charles McCrainer talked about that false alibi. He said Stephen McCullagh's claim was that between 6 o'clock and midnight he was going live. This is a complete fabrication, that he repeatedly lied to different people, because he told the court that, he prepared this recording on the 14th of December. Days before Natalie was killed, he had it all ready to go. And Charles McCrainer said that period between 6 o'clock and midnight is the period that Natalie McNally was killed. Is that just a coincidence? That's a matter for you, the jury.
Yeah, 6 o'clock and midnight, of course, when he says this live stream was going out. Now, he did change his statement whenever he was questioned by the police. And it's worth saying he changed that statement to say that he had pre-recorded it whenever he was confronted by evidence from a cybercrime expert.
Yeah, and we heard Charles McCrainer saying today it was 8 police interviews, 44 days since Natalie McNally was murdered, and this is the first time that Stephen McCullagh admitted to it being pre-recorded. So on the 1st of February, it was at this point Charles McCrainer said he lied and lied again. He lied to Natalie McNally, he lied to his friends, he lied to Natalie McNally's family, he lied to police at the scene, and he lied on different times and different dates. And he ran through all the things he said are lies, you know, lying to Natalie about being live, lying to Anne McCullagh, his friend. When he met Anne on the 17th, you know, he was very clear that he was going to be live the next day. And Anne said that she couldn't understand why he had lied to her. But Charles McCrainer says that that was the start of this false alibi, and that there was, you know, this was the start of a bigger picture. We also learned that Natalie McNally's last recorded words was, "Good luck, I might take a peek at your live stream later," and that was obviously in response to McCullagh telling her he was away to live stream the night away.
Now, you talk about the 17th of December 2022. That, of course, is the day before Natalie McNally died. And it's important to think about also what else we saw, because a lot of it was related to the 18th of December, that day that Natalie was killed, because we also were shown images of CCTV pictures, and the jury have seen these before, but it was again setting out the case, setting out some kind of a timeline. And these were CCTV pictures of a person of interest, the police suspect in this case, who travelled from Lisburn to Lurgan on a bus the night Natalie was killed. Now, this is an individual who has his face covered at one stage. He appears to be in disguise at another. But Charles McCrainer, the prosecution case, he was absolutely explicit today. They say these are pictures of the defendant, Stephen McCullagh, moving from his home to Natalie McNally's.
Yeah, and he said that this person of interest, you know, on the bus and making their way through Lurgan to Natalie's home bears a comparison to Stephen McCullagh. He talked about the hat and the wig, and he said it just happened to be a look that Stephen McCullagh had on his Instagram. He said, "Is that not just unbelievable for it to be an innocent coincidence?" The prosecution said, you know, there's a sequence to this, there's a compulsion to this, it knits together and ties together very neatly. And they also made reference to the fact that there was no activity on Stephen McCullagh's phone between 6:25 and 11:16. So 11:16 was 4 minutes after we see the taxi pull up at Stephen McCullagh's home, and Charles McCrainer said it all fits because he wasn't at home.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to say that you're quite right. This is where we get this idea of things being brought together by the prosecution, an attempt for them to do that. They compared it a bit like a jigsaw today, of having various different pieces and putting this together. So we already know, for example, that evidence suggests that Stephen McCullagh searched his phone for bus and train timetables on the day of Natalie's death. And they say those were for buses from Lisburn to Lurgan and then trains from Lurgan back to Lisburn. Now, they made the argument today that they believe that the defendant intended to get the train home, but missed the train, and that's why he ended up getting a taxi in the middle of Lurgan. Now, that's the first time we've heard them spell it out explicitly, that that's what they believe and what their argument is Stephen McCullagh was doing by looking up those train timetables. And as you pointed out there, that taxi was the one that went straight back to Stephen McCullagh's home.
Yeah, and we heard, I think, also for the first time that actually when Stephen McCullagh was looking on Google at these train timetables and the bus timetables, that Natalie was actually in his home at that point on the 17th when he was looking for timetables on his phone. Charles McCrainer actually said something interesting. He said he was looking at Sunday timetables to get a Saturday train. This doesn't make much sense. He said, why would he also be looking at a bus timetable whenever he was talking about getting a train to Natalie's home? He said, it just so happens that's the bus the person of interest gets on. And he said to the jury that might be really important. And like you say, we also heard for the first time that he missed that last train home.
Yeah, and again, we also heard today a little bit about this field, this clearing that was near Natalie McNally's house. And that's where they claim this person of interest actually changed clothes between going in and leaving that house some 39 minutes later.
Yeah, and they talked about that today. We heard some evidence, especially about Anne McCullagh and the red coat. And Charles McCrainer was saying Anne McCullagh had such a good memory and that she, remembered, and she told the police and came with those photographs to the police to say, actually, Stephen McCullagh did buy this coat. It was a £5 in a charity shop.
The other striking thing from what Charles McCrainer said, just in relation specifically to Natalie's death, was he was very clear and quite explicit about the injuries that she suffered.
Yeah, and look, we've heard these injuries before, but I think hearing it today kind of all tied up was still very shocking and I'm sure very upsetting for Natalie's family. We heard from Charles McCrainer that Natalie was subjected to a horrendous beating. Charles McCrainer told the court that she sustained a savage beating with 3 stab wounds to her neck, multiple traumatic blows and choking of her neck. He said the attack was sustained and prolonged, and she was left with her face in a dog bowl. Now, Mr. McCrainer told the court that the defendant told Natalie McNally's mother all of that detail at the wake, and he said Natalie was murdered, but the question is, by who?
We know, of course, that Stephen McCullagh claims he found Natalie's body after he became concerned about her. He was worried that she might be sick, and the court has already heard the 999 call in which Stephen McCullagh was crying and screaming. But the prosecution argued today that that was a sham, a put-on, a performance. And Charles McCrainer said he had lied time and time again to his friends, the McNally family and the police.
Yeah, he said he lied to Natalie McNally's family and also that, Natalie's family had kind of brought him in. They consoled him. He said, there was a warm embrace of a family. They left him alone with their daughter to say his goodbyes. He said that the family thought he was distraught and upset, and he, according to Charles McCrainer, still continued with the lies that he was live streaming. In fact, he says he went one step further, and took out his phone and showed it to 2 people in Natalie's parents' home saying, look at this stupid thing I was doing, stupid games, I was live streaming. And Charles McCrainer has actually said today that this was a prop, and the fact was that he was doing this, at a wake, and it showed that he was lying. It said showed lies wherever you look. He said it was just a play act and that Stephen McCullagh was putting on a show.
Of course, he strongly denies that. He says he had nothing to do with Natalie McNally's murder. It wasn't just Natalie mentioned, though, today. It was also another of Stephen McCullagh's ex-girlfriends who gave evidence during the case. And Charles McCrainer did his best to draw parallels between some of what happened in that relationship and the relationship he had with Natalie.
Yeah, I mean, we heard, maybe a couple of weeks ago from Stephen McCullagh's ex-girlfriend, and, the prosecution today said that he was damaged and betrayed by his ex-girlfriend, even recording her counselling sessions without her knowledge. He said he was looking where he shouldn't have been looking with Natalie. The prosecution said, look, this was Christmas time, which was always quite difficult for Stephen McCullagh. He had seen messages on Natalie's phone where she talks about, being independent. She talks about being happy in herself, maybe breaking up with him, but not before Christmas. And then obviously the sexting to other men. And he kind of drew a comparison between Natalie and also his relationship with his ex-partner. He said to the jury, the jury hasn't been given any evidence to challenge this ex-girlfriend's account. And he asked what, if any, use were these exchanges between McCullagh and his ex-girlfriend. And he said, look, this gives us a real indication of how he actually reacts to things. So we heard him punching the bed and getting quite angry whenever he found these text messages. And Charles McCrainer said, you could just feel it bubbling, that he'd seen these messages, she was talking to other men, and he didn't like it.
Yeah, and that goes to the issue of motive. And the prosecution, again, made clear today they don't have to show motive, but it is their argument that some of the messages that he had found on Natalie McNally's phone led to him having concerns about the future of that relationship, led to him being enraged by her conversations with other men. Now, the defence are going to give their closing arguments tomorrow, but we already know, Kelly, from having sat in there, that they have argued that one of Natalie McNally's ex-boyfriends killed her, not Stephen McCullagh. That is something that they have said, and that is something that ex-boyfriend has furiously denied in court. He did that last week. And Charles McCrainer made clear that he is not a defendant and not a suspect in this case, that this ex-boyfriend was only ever a witness in this case, albeit far from perfect.
Yeah, he said this ex-boyfriend is far from perfect, but he also said that may be an understatement. He said he had a range of unattractive features. He was, spontaneous in answering questions, and even at times, which we heard, incriminating himself. He said, we got warts and all, and the prosecution say he was telling the truth. He said also that he had genuine feelings for Natalie, but admitted that he didn't treat her very well. And he said that Stephen McCullagh used this relationship as a smoke screen. And he asked the jury, have you any doubt that this man, Stephen McCullagh, is drinking at home, or was he making his way to Natalie's house?
You mentioned doubt. The jury have to be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that Stephen McCullagh was responsible for the murder. Now, the prosecution say the questions about the ex-boyfriend that have been raised by the defence, they don't come anywhere near creating doubt in this case. And towards the end of his speech, the jury, Charles McCrainer, set out a timeline of events, pointing out inconsistencies and trying to knit together their arguments with what they said happened on the Sunday that Natalie died. I mentioned before, they compared this case to a jigsaw and encouraged the jury to put together the pieces, although he was absolutely clear it is up to the jury to decide what evidence they accept and what evidence they reject.
Yeah, and it was quite interesting just listening to Charles McCrainer go through from the 16th of December, actually from the 14th of December, right through until the 19th of December. I mean, some of the stuff he was talking about was on the 19th of December, at 12:05, Stephen McCullagh manually stops his broadcast, he deletes his recording, he texts Natalie at 8 minutes past 12, and then he texts Anne, his friend, at 10 past 12. Then there's loads of texts the next day, being very concerned about Natalie and asking, is she okay? But the one thing that struck me was that at 5 to 7 in the evening, Charles McCrainer told the jury that Stephen McCullagh ordered a KFC, and he asked the jury to consider this. He said, if you were so concerned that your pregnant girlfriend had collapsed, was possibly taking a hypo from her diabetes, would you not have gone to the house straight away? Would you have sat there and ordered a KFC?
That, of course, is the prosecution case. Tomorrow, it is the turn of the defence to make their closing arguments to the jury. They say their client, Stephen McCullagh, was not responsible for the murder and have already sought to paint a very different picture of what happened in Lurgan on the 18th of December 2022.
Yes, and we'll be back in Court 13 for that. And of course, you can subscribe now wherever you're listening to on BBC Sounds and on our YouTube channel. And we'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.